Hey guys, welcome back to Dogforge, and this time we have the first in a new series, Does It Suck? Now, the premise of this is pretty much what it says on the tin. There are some parts of 5e, shall we say, it doesn't really matter what it is, spells, particular features, subclasses, entire classes, that some people have predominant negative associations with. Be it that they are lackluster in certain areas or just outright suck. And the purpose of this series is to evaluate if that is actually true, and a little bit of subtlety, is that actually true, or is that only true when you take it to the extreme and you look at the hyper optimization that really relies on outliers of the system rather than what the system expects or the average of the system. Now, in this, the first episode, as you've probably already seen by the title, I assume people read those, we are taking a look at Do Monks Suck specifically. Now, in terms of what we're going to look at here, we're going to break it down into a few things. One of the primary complaints I tend to see is that the monk's damage is lackluster. So we'll be taking a look at the monk's damage and some comparisons to stuff. Their features, it's actually surprising to me how much that monk's features kind of get, for lack of a better term, clowned on, which I will delve into more when we get there. And finally, theme, which we'll also go into the expectations of. So we're going to start with that last one in particular, theme. Now, the monk is heavily inspired, not really so much by actual real-world martial arts, but more the fictionalized extreme versions of them. Traditionally, you can see a lot of, older Asian martial arts movies where you get that, super fast, the kind of Ip Man chain punching Wing Chun stuff, as well as the more, leaping through the air, wire work kind of movement inspired things as well. That's not undoubtedly the only place that the monk tropes and archetypes come from, but when we look at it, that's really the main source of thing. Now, through subclasses, they delve into some things a bit more heavily, such as the Drunken Master archetype. Probably the more recognizable one that comes to mind in regards for that is Jackie Chan, who through various movies and portrayals popularized that kind of thing for a lot of people in the West. As well as the more weapon-orientated monks that you get through the Kensai, that kind of thing. So, in terms of what we want, and this is the case with a lot of classes actually, there's no clear thing, it's more just like we're going for a feel. And that feel is that this class should be really fast, mobile, it should be good with its body, and kind of lean more into using its body than just relying on weapons, and it should be making lots of quick attacks, that kind of thing, with some additional mysticism sprinkled in, kind of evoking that chi or ki, depending on what language you derive it from, that kind of origin. Now, just dipping into expectations with this part, which is going to segue us into the damage section. The monk is a martial class, and one of the things that some people, particularly in the optimization community, fall into the pitfalls of is that when they see a martial class, the expectation is damage. This is, to some degree, understandable. Martials hit things. They almost all, barring the rogue, get extra attack, and a lot of the time they're going to be taking the attack action primarily in combat. So you get this expectation of martials primarily should just be doing damage, and they should be excelling at damage. And when you carry those kinds of expectations in, I'm not saying that they shouldn't be doing good damage. My actual belief is that the monk's damage is perfectly fine, and I'll show you why. But when you carry that kind of generic belief of damage first, and you don't actually look at what the class is bringing, you don't take a step back and say, I think a martial should be damaged, but what does the class actually present us? Then I think you fall into the pitfalls of feeling that damage is lackluster, when in reality It's not really at the forefront of the class to begin with, and it's actually in line with system expectations. So let's go ahead and jump into the damage portion. So I've got some comparisons through tier 1 to tier 4. We'll go through those, and I'll make this comparison document available down in the description below so you can read through it at your own leisure, particularly if you're an audio only listener or I'm second monitor, which I get. I'm not claiming to be main monitor content, okay? So we have some assumptions here. The first assumption is that monks will use a two-handed quarterstaff, or quarterstaff two-handed, to get the d8. This, in terms of how people actually play, I can see some people naturally gravitating towards this, particularly if you're a Donatello fan, or you just, you like some of the traditionally depicted, more Shaolin-style monks with the bow staffs. I'm primarily doing this because people that have an inkling towards wanting to do damage, this is the easiest way to optimize monk damage. They get a quarterstaff, they have no reason to not use it two-handed, so it's just the best way to make sure that we're putting them on their best foot forward. Now, to go along with that, I'm not just favoring monks here. We're actually doing highest damage in all aspects. For that reason, the rogue comparison is using a rapier to give it a d8 versus a scimitar, short sword, short bow. A rogue is more likely to be doing a d6 for its weapon damage, they just are, but I'm using the rapier to try and make everything as competitive as possible in the confines of the comparison. For the same reason, the cantrips that we'll be looking at is Firebolt, which outside of Eldritch Blast being modified is the highest damage cantrip, with the slight exception of Toll the Dead, but that has a condition, so we're ignoring that. Eldritch Blast will be used with Agonizing Blast, but we'll discuss a little bit more about that later. In terms of the damage itself, we are not considering accuracy, because in this comparison, accuracy will be standardized. Everyone will have the same 2-hit modifier, so it doesn't matter. And for ASIs will be used to max primary stats as soon as possible. And to reflect that in the comparisons, anytime you see a number in parentheses, that's the damage after being modified by an ASI that takes part in that tier. For rogue sneak attack damage, because this increases every other level, so it's going to increase multiple times per tier, I'm going to represent that by dividing numbers by a slash, and every time you see a slash, it's just the next increment in sneak attack damage. And then there's also a number in brackets that we will get to when we get to it. Subclasses, races, and feats are not factored in. I might talk about stuff like that, but this is purely just, for the most part, have a class. If the class gets extra attack, it gets extra attack. If it has sneak attack, it has sneak attack. And just see what their damage is with nothing but those core things, and choosing the best weapon available to them. So, let's jump right on into it, and first of all we have tier 1. Now, I don't think anyone really has any complaints about monks in tier 1. As you can see by this number breakdown here, monks actually lead the pack in terms of damage in tier 1. Particularly with the cantrip option falling well behind. So this is because essentially in tier 1, where everyone has just a single attack, the value and power of getting a bonus action attack period, but especially one where you can add your modifier, is really very important. That to some extent does also hold true as you level, but it is most noticeable in tier 1. And the Monk's Martial Arts feature effectively gives it the ability to act as if it had two-weapon fighting as a fighting style. You can see that as we have here a fighter using two-weapon fighting, and the numbers are actually identical, with the higher quarterstaff balancing against the lower martial arts type bonus action attack, to basically be what you would get if you just used a short sword twice. Now we also have here a fighter using dueling, so longsword, rapier, doesn't matter, it's a d8 weapon, with that +2 modifier thrown into damage from the dueling fighting style. We have a Barbarian who is not raging, using a Maul, a normal Firebolt, and Eldritch Blast, assuming that Agonizing Blast is in play. So as you can see in tier 1, the Monk is tied for fighter at really top of the tier, both doing 13 damage and then going up to 15 at level 4 with an ASI. Moving into tier 2, where extra attack comes online, the Rogue gets a sneak attack, cantrip scale, things get a little bit more competitive. So here we have a Monk also getting a martial arts die increase for their bonus action attack, and they're going to be doing 2 quarterstaff strikes plus their modifiers plus the martial arts attack for 24.5, or after the 8th level ASI, 27.5. This is, before ASI, actually the highest damage. The fighter is not far behind, neither is the Rogue, the 2-weapon fighting fighter that is. With the Barbarian pretty much right with the 2-weapon fighting and Rogue, with Firebolt well behind, as is Eldritch Blast quite a few points behind. After ASI, things even up quite a lot, with the fighter 2-weapon fighting in particular going up to 25.5. The Monk is still ahead at 27.5, but that's only half a point on average higher than the Rogue after their ASI and final sneak attack increase of the tier, which takes them up to 27. But as you can see, tier 2, the Monk is still leading the pack in terms of damage here. Again, we're not talking resources for the most part. This, and we'll touch on this now, 2-weapon fighting, dueling are fighting styles. Agonizing Blast is an invocation. Those are class resources effectively that are more permanently and passively invested. So I'm considering those to give a more accurate and grounded representation of damage comparison. But in realistic terms, a Monk would be using their key more often, and they have some subclasses that tend to give damage. So in all actuality, the Monk damage should be higher, as should some of the others. The Barbarian, for instance, should be raging, but we're trying to do as resourceless and base level as possible to really decide how the damage actually is. Now, tier 3 is where we get kind of a general sentiment from a lot of people that martials in general fall off. I don't agree. And here you can see kind of like the beginnings, and that does specifically apply to the Monk as well. Here we can see that beginning to really show through for the Monk, as they don't get another attack, and the only core class guaranteed benefit they're going to get damage-wise is the martial arts die increase. So their damage is going to increase to 28.5 as their bonus action attack becomes a D8 to match up to their quarterstaff. At this point, doesn't matter if they use a quarterstaff or anything else, it's all going to be D8s. And then a Rogue is, even at the beginning of the tier, already surpassing them with 30.5. Both the 2-weapon fighting and dueling fighters are around the 34 mark, which, you know, just going to point that out for people that might have something bad to say about 2-weapon fighting. The Barbarian with the Maul, that's still hanging down in the 24, and that's because a Barbarian should be raging, getting that rage bonus, especially as you get higher up in levels and get more rages, and because they do have multiple subclasses that do contribute actual damage as well. Firebolt is scaling up to 16.5. As you can see, Firebolt is leading the pack, generally speaking, in terms of cantrips, ignoring Eldritch Blast, which is frankly more of a class feature. But even that is still, in tier 3 scaling, well behind the Monk still. Eldritch Blast is pumping up to 31.5, assuming, of course, maxed out Charisma, 3 beams. So the Monk is not at the bottom here at all. With the Barbarian, Firebolt both below it, and there's not really that much difference between it and the things ahead. So you can honestly say, does that small difference in damage really matter? Realistically speaking, I say no. However, we also need to consider that a monk is a class that is designed around ki. Ki is a short rest resource that scales based on your monk level. By the time you reach tier 3, which starts at 11th level, a monk has 11 ki points. So, whilst you can make an argument in tier 2, and certainly in tier 1 don't even consider ki for damage comparisons unless you're talking about novas. But in tier 3, 11 ki per short rest. So, a long rest based day is meant to be 4 to 6 encounters depending on difficulty. If we assume, 6, we try and stretch those resources. We say that we're going to have 2 combats per short rest, and those combats are going to be, let's say, 8 total rounds. The average is actually around about 3 rounds per combat, especially if you're talking about more combats per day. But let's say that it's a little bit higher than average. Let's say it's 4 rounds, in which case a monk at this level has enough ki to flurry of blows every single combat turn and still have 3 ki left over in case the combat goes a little long, or they want to use another feature like Step of the Wind, Patient Defense, or some of the options brought in Tasha's Cauldron of Everything. So in tier 3, you can very validly assume a monk is always flurrying. Now, depending what subclass you are, that can maybe change a little bit, such as the Astral Self has some ki investment that really cuts away that extra space, so you can't necessarily guarantee their flurry of blowings. They're using flurry of blows that often. However, that subclass also has built-in damage scaling. And when you look at the flurry of blows damage, which is adding at this level an extra attack for 1d8 plus 5, the damage goes up to 38. So this is really quite interesting, because this is what you should be assuming that a monk is doing on any given round at this level. And this is what I've been talking about so far is 11th level. A monk gets an extra ki point every level, and you do not see a tier change again until level 17. So a monk should be flurrying most of the time. And when they flurry, their damage goes up to 38. Now, a rogue, even at the end of the tier, is still half a point of damage below that. These fighters, who again should be occasionally novering with Action Surge, should have subclasses, blah blah blah, but we're taking a look at the core classes, those are 3.5 to 4 points behind. Eldritch Blast, well, that's a full 6.5 points behind. There's no real reasonable argument that a monk's damage is lackluster in the actual environment it's presented in terms of at will damage and stuff. And if you want to talk about optimized damage, then that changes again. We'll just quickly take a look at tier 4, where a monk goes up to 3d10s. And again, their main damage does not increase that much, because it's just an average of 1 point per die increase with the d10s. But their flurry damage also increases slightly, and it goes up to 42. And 42 is on track with an Eldritch Blast that had an Invocation, which is quite a significant resource for a Warlock, invested in it from the beginning. Firebolt is almost half the damage. The fighter options are pushing ahead as they get their Capstone feature, but that's only happening at 20th level. The Rogue is pushing ahead in the second half of the tier as they get their final sneak attack increase. Monk damage, when you actually look at what you should be expecting from monks, is not falling behind. This is their at-will damage. I have not spoken about Nova damage. I have not included Flurry of Blows before tier 3, because we weren't talking about Nova damage. We're talking about at-will damage, just what a monk's going to do, kind of baseline, which also helps kind of remove player behavior somewhat from things. Like, a player might like using their subclass abilities a lot. A player might like using Patient Defense more. Like, when we remove Flurry of Blows, we kind of standardize more, like, if people are burning their ki doing other stuff. And I think that's a good representation of standard damage. Now, if you want to talk about Nova, quote-unquote, potential, I mean, that's really where subclasses, feats, and races come in, which is the case for pretty much every class. For true Nova potential, where you're getting seriously impressive stuff, it usually includes a subclass, at the very least, if not also feats. A Kensai monk is automatically going to elevate the standard damage just because they can use a longsword. So these d8s turn to a d10, and what was already top of the pack damage gets increased by 1 or 2 points depending how many attacks they're making with that longsword. And then you have certain considerations, like what if a Kensai wants to be an archer, at which point the Tasha's features that gave them an accuracy boost and ki fueled attack, when you spend ki, like on the accuracy boost, you get a bonus action attack, which means that Kensai monk archers are not only incredibly mobile, they're not only excellent switch hitters because they are very good in melee for being, archery based, but they can pretty reliably get off the sharpshooter sharpshooter plus 10 damage, being able to use that -5 benefit offset against the accuracy boost, which I believe is like +2 per 1 ki spent that you can use after the die. And even if it still wouldn't help, you can just spend a ki to still make a bonus action attack with that longbow. Or you could look at Mercy Monks, who gets Hand of Harm for an extra martial arts die plus wisdom. Or you can look at a Astral Self Monk, who gets an extra attack and an extra damage dice thrown in. And that's before you consider other things like the potential of a monk grabbing a fighting style using a feat, or grabbing a racial damage increase, such as being a goblin and using Fury of the Small to add a little bit of Nova every now and then, being a bugbear and not only getting a reach on your melee attacks, but taking advantage of that high dexterity modifier and getting that extra, was it 2d6 or 2d8 per attack if you go before the other creature in the first turn. Monk damage is only quote-unquote lackluster when you start looking at outliers. When you start looking at things that are extremely well optimized using outlying feats, features, subclasses, and then you don't really do the same for the monk. Because the monk should be doing competitive damage just based on what they have. And I hope that has hopefully illustrated that for a lot of people. Again, we've not really spoke in depth about Nova damage. I have touched on it a little bit, giving you like an idea of what some monks can do to boost their Nova damage. Not all monk subclasses are damage additional in a straightforward manner. A Shadow Monk, for instance, might do slightly higher damage, but that's going to be because they're using things like Darkness and their teleportation ability to get advantage and raise their accuracy. So it's not all straightforward, but when I present this kind of thing, I just tend to want to make this as understandable for people as possible. So that is the damage aspect done. So next up we have the features thing. Now some people, and I really don't understand this, will talk down about monk features. They're not that good, they're not that powerful. And what really confuses me is that other classes don't get this level of scrutiny because they don't have those features. I don't mean, of course, they don't have the same monk features. I mean, their design space does not give them features. Because a lot of the time when you look at the monk, they are getting features in addition to other things they're getting when classes otherwise don't get stuff. So let's look at third level with Deflect Missiles. Deflect Missiles is a very solid ranged defense ability. You get it at third level, as well as your key point going up to 3. But you also get it with your subclass. Most, if not, I think all other classes only get their subclass as a core feature. And our subclass can give you a lot of stuff, but the core class gives you primarily just that. Now, spellcasting classes go up to second level in terms of spell level, but they're not getting actual features, they're not getting core features, it's just their smooth spellcasting scaling. Monks are getting an additional thing. Fourth level, everyone gets an ASI. The monk gets an ASI plus their key point, which you could compare to spell slots, I guess, or second wind scaling, that kind of thing. But they also get slow fall, which is not only great for helping remove incidental damage. Say you get pushed off a cliff, a rooftop, you fall down a pit trap, that kind of thing. Slow fall, and this is part of something I think a lot of people that just criticize the monk without necessarily giving it a shot, or seeing people play it that aren't really taking advantage of the monk. Slow fall completely changes how a character thinks about things, because you can now jump off of stuff willingly and take essentially next to no damage. Slow fall's calculation is very, very generous. Let's just jump down here. So 5 times your monk level. Falling damage is only a d6 per 10 feet, and it caps at 10 d6. Like, it's not a lot of damage to begin with, and 5 times your monk level, when you get it, you're already reducing it by 20. You're most likely not going to take that much fall damage most of the time, but this actively scales in a pretty aggressive manner every single time you get a monk level. By the time you get to 9th level and you can run up walls and stuff, you could feasibly just jump out of an airship without caring. Now, you could say that's a failure of the, I believe, optional Xanathar's rules we got for fall damage. But we have to look at what we have. We have to look at the game itself. And in the game itself, monks tend to not care about falling. And when you don't care about fall damage, you can move in an entirely different way. Which is something else that we have to consider, is their movement speed. Movement speed for a monk increases, jump by jump, from 10 foot initially to 30 feet. And now, if you just think about it logically, well, there's only a finite amount of times that movement speed is necessary. There are still going to be times where it's not enough. There are going to be times where it's entirely irrelevant. But when you play a monk, and you have that movement speed, and the same is true as a tabaxi, which stacks wonderfully with a monk, when you have that movement speed, it just changes how you approach things. When you know that you can move that fast, or even faster since you have Step of the Wind, which also improves your jumping even though you're not a strength-based character, that entirely changes your perception of how you move and how you handle your character, which I think is more often seen in actual play than just thought experiments. Knowing that you can chase somebody down that you shouldn't really be able to catch. I've done this as a monk. I've played in a one-shot as a monk, I think as an Ascendant Dragon, and an NPC was meant to get away and alert everyone else. Except I burned some ki and I ran him down even though he was dashing and had a substantial lead. Something that most characters would not have been able to achieve. Realistically, in terms of like the distance I covered, ignoring tabaxi like double speed things, the realistic thing is that it would have been like a 4th level spell slot to Dimension Door to cover the distance. Or at best maybe a dashing mount. But as a monk you can just do it when you want to. You don't have to rely on having a particular spell and spell slot available. You don't have to rely on having a mount that has had to survive to that point. So let's just go through. Stunning Strike, I don't think people tend to give Stunning Strike a bad rep. In fact, I think that a lot of people tend to ignore monk damage because they just tend to focus on stunning strike. This is also kind of a pitfall, to be honest, because you get stunning strike at a level where you only have 5 keep or short rest, but you can spend a key on stunning strike when you make attacks, so you can burn through your key exceptionally quickly, very suddenly. Especially you got your subclass abilities at 3rd. I think that some people's dissatisfaction with a monk comes from feeling like they don't have enough key initially. That's definitely not the case as you go into the latter half of the game. By the time you hit tier 3, you 100% have enough key that you can do what you want. There's still a little bit of balance trade-off because that's how resources should work. But in the latter half of the game, you have no worries in terms of key resource, really. The beginning half of the game, you can make a solid argument that just to feel better playing a monk at the very least, a monk could do with slightly more key. Now, if that is something that you feel, personally, I would just say just let them have their wisdom modifier added on to the formula, so it's monk level plus wisdom modifier. Now, that is going to it will definitely increase their power in the latter half. That I don't think they need. But if you're not going to be playing tier 3 and beyond, it's not really a consideration. And most people don't. Most people just play tier 1 in the beginning of tier 2. That's where a lot of the resources we have for playing live. With the starter packs, the more popular adventures, they don't go super high to begin with. Now we look at 6th level and we have key empowered strikes. We have a key point, we have a speed boost, on top of getting another subclass feature. At 6th level, other classes aren't getting all this stuff. Right? I mean, if you're a spellcaster, you'll get an additional spell slot and a subclass feature. But a monk is steadily getting quite a lot of stuff. Key empowered strikes, similar to how a moon druid gets the magical claws. I can't remember the feature right now. That's important for ensuring reliability of damage, because at its core, a monk does not need to rely on magical weapons to overcome resistance and immunity to non-magical BPS. They get it built in, and that's great. Level 7, evasion is an amazing ability. Evasion is their primary ability. They get another key point. So when people tend to then look at stillness of mind, you can use an action to end one effect on yourself, causing you to be charmed or frightened. Well, it takes an entire action. It could really be a bonus action. It's not even their main ability at that level. I hope I'm coming across making myself clear what the issue is. People tend to look at features and then pick them apart, but they don't step back and think those features only exist on a monk. It's like that design space does not exist on most, if not all, other classes. Now, for spellcasters, you could argue that it's spells, and to which I would also say the majority of spells kind of suck. Well, not suck necessarily, but they're more in line with what the system expects at the very least. Whereas people tend to just kind of focus on outlier spells, when we have a lot of spells that would perhaps be chosen by a player for thematic reasons or because they just thought it was cool or useful, that are not those standout outliers. What are other people getting at 7th level? Generally speaking, not as much as a monk. Now, I know, yes, casters 4th level spells, blah blah blah, but again, the value of that's entirely based around what you choose for 4th level spells, whereas we know for a fact what a monk is getting. I mean, if you compare that with a rogue gets a d6 sneak attack increase and evasion. They get evasion, stillness of mind, and a key point, and that's a lot, especially since the key point is per short rest. It is going to be dependent on your table, and if a monk sucks in your experience just because you don't short rest enough, entirely valid, not the monk's fault. Warlocks would suck in that instance, a lot of fighters would suck in that instance. That is a table issue. That is not a monk problem. So, like some other aspects, Tongue of Sun of the Moon, it's a high level feature, but it's cool. I mean, in terms of other people doing it, you're looking at spending spells for like tongues or something like that, and monks can just do it. That's cool. There are some features here that people can't really say anything negative about as well, like Diamond Soul. Diamond Soul is an amazing ability. You know, proficiency in everything, the ability to reroll saves as well. That's amazing. And that kind of hints here at something I'm going to point out, and that is that people have the preconception of martials equal damage. Look at how classes actually scale. Monks scale the amount of times that they can use their stuff with ki pretty steadily, pretty smooth scaling. However, they scale their mobility. They scale their durability. A monk steadily gets more and more defensive features, and their previous defensive features continue to scale. Alright? Slowfall, they get it at 4th level, but it'll continue to scale in effectiveness and reliability with their level. Sorry, 1 second. In terms of, Diamond Body, that's great, but even that will continue to scale as they have more ki to spend on the rerolls and their proficiency moves from 5 to 6. A monk is a pretty overall well-rounded martial. They have a lot of mobility. They have damage that, I'm sorry, is good enough. Some people might not like good enough, but I've already illustrated their damage and pointed out that their damage can well exceed what I have shown. They have a built-in control ability. Monks at the core are kind of a surprisingly tanky, mobile martial. The only real criticism in terms of features that I could see is that maybe monks should be able to hit and run a little more reliably. Perhaps they should get something like mobile, or the swashbucklers hit somebody or attack somebody and be able to disengage. To which I say, be nice, but monks can take mobile. Kensais can use whips. You can use your bonus action to step of the wind away. You don't need those things because the monk already has the ability to do so. It's just some people don't like giving up resources or bonus actions in order to do that, and classes shouldn't be able to do everything without investment. That's certainly a power fantasy, but that's kind of boring in a lot of ways as well. So that was my kind of ramble on the features of the monk. Let's take a long back and see if we've addressed everything. Features, do monk features suck? I'm not going through all of them here. I will do that in a future series though. But whilst not all of them are incredibly powerful, the ones that people most often criticize are actually in very niche design space that other classes don't get to begin with. They have a lot of great features, and really it's expectation and not looking at the class and seeing what it should be doing that is a pitfall for a lot of people. I'm not saying that you have to be happy with the monk. Certainly the theme could be something entirely what you don't want. You might want it to represent something else. That's entirely valid. If a class is not doing what you want it to do, then that's a perfectly valid source of dissatisfaction. But you have to understand sometimes that that is coming from not necessarily a failure of the mechanics to represent that, but that the mechanics aren't trying to represent that to begin with. In terms of damage, the whole martial should be doing damage things. Monks do damage. Monks do damage pretty well most of the time and can push it even higher. Monks are very versatile. I can't see in any which way that you can make, this is the royal you, a claim that monks suck, because they don't. They might not match your particular expectations, but when you look at the class as it is in 5e, holding back those previous edition biases, holding back well, I saw that in a movie and I want to be able to do that thing. When you look at the class, when you look at the system, monks don't suck at all. and in my experience seeing players play them, they're a lot of fun to play. But that is just my ramble. That is just what I think. Do you think that monks suck? Do you think that I got anything wrong here? Do you think I didn't mention something in particular? Let me know in the comment section down below. And if you've got this far, thank you. I very much appreciate it. But if you got this far, you probably like hearing me talk enough to hit that subscribe and like button, both of which greatly help out the channel. Until next time, I've been Paul, and I will see you at the Forge.